Hello everyone, my name is Oops I Dev'd, and today we're gonna have a look at adding animations in Godot 4. Let's get into it. Okay, so in Godot, there are two ways of animating nodes in our game, and these are via the Animated Sprite 2D and Animation Player nodes. The Animated Sprite 2D node is usually used to animate sprites, as it is the easier and quicker way to add frame-by-frame animations for, say, our characters idling, attacking, moving, talking, and so on. The Animation Player node, on the other hand, is a more powerful tool that can be used to add animations to nodes such as sprites, canvas layer items such as color recs and labels, and more. It is a bit more feature-rich than the Animated Sprite 2D node because it's not limited to only sprites or textures. You can animate other nodes with it as well. In a practical sense, you'll most probably use the Animated Sprite 2D node for your character or enemy sprite animations because it won't change. You're just trying to animate your character and their movements. But you'll use the Animation Player node to add more complex animations, such as beautiful loading screens or cutscenes or object revealing. Enough talking, let's see these nodes in action. Okay, so let's start a new project and focus on the Animated Sprite 2D node first. Before we start, all of the assets that I will be using for this next part can be found in the description box below, but feel free to use any assets that you want, as long as it's a sprite sheet. I'm just gonna drag in my assets and then it'll import. I've showed you this before in another video, but I'm gonna do it again. If you skip those and are only watching this one, you'll see that once you've imported your assets and you drag in your sprite sheet, you'll see that the image is blurry. To fix this, we need to go into project settings, then underneath rendering, textures, change the default texture filter from linear to nearest. And voila, our sprite sheet is now beautiful and clear. Okay, so in our new scene, let's add a character body 2D as our root node. We'll get an error because we need to add a collision body to it. So let's add a collision shape 2D. Once again, if you get lost and you want to focus on your node, just press F. Let's add a circle shape 2D as our collision. Then selecting our character body 2D, let's add an Animated Sprite 2D node. You'll see that it gives us a warning because we haven't defined any texture or sprite frames to it. So in the Properties panel, go into Animation, Sprite Frames, and select New Sprite Frames. Then click on Sprite Frames, and the Animation Frames panel will open. You can see that in this Animation Sprite Frame panel, there will already be a default animation, which has no frames. You'll need to add sprite frames, which will be the frames of your animation, underneath the Add Frames from Sprite Sheet option. You can also add a new animation or delete the animation. Then we can loop the animation, as well as change its frames per second. Let's add some frames from our sprite sheet. When this panel opens, head into the directory where your sprite sheet has been saved. Then say open. You can zoom in by holding down Ctrl and moving your mouse wheel up and down. So for this sprite sheet, because it's just one line, we want the vertical bars to only be valued at 1. If this was like a multiple line sprite sheet, say this row was also here, then we'll change it to 2. For this, we want it to be equal to 7. If the sizing here wasn't the same, and say this box had a big white space here, then the animation would look off because it will jump to the side. So try and find sprite sheets that are of similar frame sizes. Then you'll go ahead and select the frames that you want. For this run animation, we'll select each frame and then add them. You can then see when we press play that the animation would play. This looks a little too slow. Let's up it to, say, 7. That looks a little bit better. Finding this frames per second for me usually is just the process of playing around and seeing what looks good. You can also rearrange sprites. So say you want this one to play before that one and vice versa, then you can move them around using these buttons here. You can also add empty frames before and after certain frames. Let's rename this default animation to run. Now, let's save our scene as, say, player. After that, add a script to your scene. And now let's run this animation. Let's run it on an input event. If you don't know about the input actions, I made a whole nother video on this, so go check it out. Okay, so let's use our input events function to play the run animation every time we press the down arrow on our keyboard. So to do that, we first use our input events function. Then we'll say if event.isActionPressed UI down. Then you can reference your animated sprite node via the $, or you can just drag it in. I like to drag it because it copies the whole path, making it just quicker and easier to reference. Then we'll say .play run. This will now run the animation every time we press the down arrow key. The animated sprite 2D node also has a bunch of sub-functions that you can read about in the Godot 4 documentation. You can do a lot with the animated sprite 2D node. I'm just showing you the basics of how to create an animation and how to basically call it so it runs. Let's move our character a little bit forward. Do not do this if this is your actual player. I'm just doing this because I don't have a main level scene right now, but I'm just going to drag it so that we can actually see it. Otherwise, it will be hidden in the corner of the window. Okay, so now if we press the down button, our player animation should work. You see, now it is just running constantly. This is where you'll check if another button is being pressed, do this animation instead, or if no button is being pressed, like everything has been released, then return to the idle animation. But this is just a simple example to show you how to implement a basic animation. Now, let's do the same, but with the animation player. Let's delete our animated sprite and add an animation player node. You'll have to reset the position of the collision shape. Now, to add an animation to the animation player, we just go down to our animation editor and select new animation. Let's call this run. So you'll see you can add different tracks, right? And this track will animate a certain node. Right now, we do not have a node to animate, so we'll need to add a Sprite 2D node. So let's do that first. Add a Sprite 2D node, and in textures, drag in and drop your idle run animation or your sprite sheet. Then in the animations panel, let's leave our V-frames because just like in the animation sprite 2D, it was 1 and then change your H frames to 7. Remember, we also did this for the animation sprite. It's just to crop out the individual frames. You can change the frames as so. We can add an animation through the property tracks here, which I'd usually do if I had a UI item, such as a label that I wanted to make visible or invisible, but we can do it much easier in the properties panel. Let's not do it via that for now. With your Sprite 2D selected in your inspector and underneath animations, here at frame with 0 as the default, click this key, say create. Now you'll see that this keyframe has been added. You can zoom in on this track by holding down Control and scrolling in with your mouse wheel. You can also change the length of the animation here and the looping property here. Now, let's go to 0.1 and select 1 and add another key. You can do this till it reaches the end. You'll now see that when you run the animation, the running animation starts and stops, so we'll have to cut it to its length. That's better. Once it's reached the end, we want to loop it. Let's see how that looks. We can see it's not the best animation, but let's call it in our script to see if it works. We're going to do the same as before, but now we're just going to drag in our animation player, .play, run. So every time we press UI down, animation player will play our newly created run animation. Just like with the animated sprite 2D node, the animation player has many sub-methods and functions. Check it out in the documentation. Once again, let's move all 3 of these to a space in our map that we can see. Now if we press down the down key, we're supposed to be able to see it. And our animation runs. Obviously, we still need to add functionality to get it to stop running. But hey, we successfully added an animation that runs. Maybe don't add that first idle frame because that does look a little awkward, but for the most part, it works and it was a success. I hope this video helped you get a basic understanding of animations in Godot 4. While this video was not an in-depth look at all the properties offered by these nodes, I do recommend you go and play around and experiment with the two ways of adding animations. There's also another thing called an animation tree, but we'll get into that in a more in-depth video in the future, maybe when we make an actual game. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, give it a thumbs up and subscribe if you'd like. Until next time, bye!